Hey everyone, Michael here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to continue our mini-series on microphone placements. In the last video, we looked at mono or one microphone overhead setups, and today we're going to look at stereo or two microphone overhead setups. Now, a two overhead stereo microphone setup is arguably the most popular way to capture the sound of a drum set, especially when you're dealing with a jazz drum set sound where the overall sound that you're getting is mostly coming from your overhead microphones. Having the right placement is crucial for getting the sound that you want. So there are a world of possibilities when it comes to placing two microphones, and I would highly suggest to experiment and find the sound that you're looking for. Today, we're going to give you a jump start by looking at 5 different setups, 2 coincident pairs, and 3 spaced pairs. Wait a second, what is a coincident pair? So a coincident pair is when both microphones are placed close together to mitigate phase issues. Now, if you're familiar with phase, you could probably skip ahead to the next chapter as this topic has been covered many times. But if you're not, phase is important to talk about, especially when you're dealing with capturing a single sound source with multiple microphones. Now, I'm going to get a little nerdy here, but in essence, phase is the time arrival of sound to multiple microphones. If you look at a sound wave, there are peaks and valleys along a neutral axis. When a sound wave arrives at 2 microphones at the same point in the wave, for example, the very top of the wave, those mics are said to be in phase with each other. Now, if for some reason they arrive at different times, say the top of the wave to one microphone and the bottom of the wave to a different microphone, the waves will essentially cancel each other out. And you can hear this for yourself. Record some audio on a single channel, duplicate the channel, and invert the phase using a utility plugin, and you won't hear anything. Now, in the real world, you won't get true cancellation because of factors like room reflections, but you will hear the sound get thin and maybe even a phasing-like sound from the cymbals, like a So, obviously, it's not a good thing to have in your recordings, and of course, you could fix some of these issues in post, but I like to try and get the mics in phase with my positioning so I don't have to worry about it later. So the benefit of a coincident pair is that the microphones are occupying the same physical space, and you'll have 0 phase issues. So with that being said, let's look at our first setup, the XY pattern. So XY is my favorite stereo overhead setup because it's phase coherent and it gets a very natural, organic sound with a medium amount of stereo separation. It involves placing the mics directly above the drum set at a 90-degree angle with the capsules almost touching. Using a stereo bar for these kind of setups is recommended to make things easier, and I really like this one from Red. It comes with spacers so the mics can be positioned together but parallel to each other, and it allows you to mount both microphones on a single stand. If you do that, I recommend using a weight or sandbags on the base of the microphone stand to prevent the mics from falling over. Trust me, I've learned the hard way. So for today, we're going to use my favorite overhead mics, the Earthworks SR25s. Like in the last video, you're only going to hear the sound of the overheads with no post-processing, and when we do some back-to-backs later, I'll add in a Shure Beta 52A on the bass drum. So let's hear what the XY sounds like. Our next setup is another coincident pair, or I guess near coincident, and it's called ORTF. The name comes from a department at Radio France. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but I'll put it down here. And it was invented in 1960 to capture studio orchestras. Now, on the surface, It looks similar to XY, except the mics are close to touching near the back, and the capsules are further apart from each other. Now, to get a true ORTF setup, there is a specific way to set up the microphones. The angle of the microphone should be at 110 degrees, and the capsules should be spaced at 17 centimeters apart. Now, it's always good to experiment with different angles and distances, but it is important to note here that there is a specific distance that the capsules need to be at, and for today's purposes, I did place them at 17 centimeters. Now, because the microphones are more spaced out, you're going to get a little bit more stereo separation than XY. Now, this setup is very popular for capturing a source in stereo that is far away, for example, a chamber ensemble or an orchestra, but I've seen this technique used enough on drum overheads to use it as a valid setup, and I particularly like it. It is a little bit more cumbersome to set up than the XY, which is why I prefer the XY, but I really do like this sound. So let's hear what ORTF sounds like. Okay, now we're going to get to stereo setups that are not coincident, and we'll start with probably the most popular overhead miking technique, which is a spaced pair. This setup is really flexible, and you can really fine-tune what you capture on the drum set by where and how you place the mics. For today's purposes, we're going to place the mics in such a way that will capture the entire drum set as opposed to, say, focusing on just the cymbals. Since we're dealing with a spaced pair, we now have to take phase into consideration. The best way to set up a pair of microphones so that they're phase coherent is to match the distance between the two microphones and the source. Now, I like to use the bass drum as my source because it's centrally located on the drum set, and since I usually use a bass drum microphone with the overheads, it's nice to make sure all three microphones are working together. The way I like to do it is I like to take a microphone cable and place one end between the bass drum beater and the batter head to hold it in place, and then measure the distance to the first microphone. I'll pinch the cable at that measurement and move it to the second mic. If the distance to both microphones match, then I know that they'll be in phase. There's a little trial and error at first to get both mics placed where you need them, but over time, you'll know generally where both mics need to go, and it won't take you long at all. All right, our next setup is another popular setup called the Glyn technique, named after an engineer at IBC Studios in London who recorded great English rock bands like the Beatles and the Who. Now, this setup is used more in rock music, but it does work for any genre, and particularly it works well in jazz. Now, what's different about this setup is that it approaches the kit from two angles. One microphone is placed directly above the snare drum looking down at the kit, and the other is looking at the drum set from the floor tom side, also pointing at the snare drum, and they're the same distance apart. So using the microphone cable technique from earlier, I placed the mics using the snare drum as my point of reference instead of the bass drum. Now, obviously, this setup is very snare drum focused, but it gets a really nice picture of the entire kit. And another advantage to this setup is that it works equally well in mono, and you can adjust the stereo spread in the mix. For today, I'll leave the mics hard panned left and right like the other examples. Okay, so our last setup is one that you may not have heard of, and there's a little backstory involved. So when I lived in Denver, Colorado, I regularly played at Dazzle, which is one of the jazz clubs in town, and one that a lot of national acts tour through. So not only would I play there a lot, I would go and see shows there all the time as a listener, so I have a lot of experience with that room. Now the sound there is okay, but one night I went to see Wolfgang Muffspiel, Scott Colley, and Brian Blade, and from the first note I could tell that there was something different. Now obviously these musicians are world class, but I couldn't help but notice how good Dazzle sounded. It was totally different from other times that I've been there. And I noticed the way the drums in particular sounded amazing and were mic'd very unusually, something I've never seen used at Dazzle before. Now, I looked around the audience and noticed a woman with an iPad doing front of house, and I put two and two together that Wolfgang was traveling with their own engineer. The next day, I asked someone at Dazzle if they caught the name of Wolfgang's engineer, and they told me her name was Claudia Engelhart. After a little research, I found out that she's been Bill Frisell's front of house engineer for decades. And then it clicked. I've seen this overhead technique before. There's a video of Bill Frisell, Thomas Morgan, and Rudy Royston playing in New York, which I'll leave in the description because it's fantastic, with that exact same microphone setup. So doing a little bit more digging, I found an interview with Claudia where she specifically talks about this overhead technique. She places the microphones over the shoulders of the drummer, pointed at the drum set, and she says that it captures a true-to-life representation of what the drummer is hearing, which makes a lot of sense because the microphones are fairly close to the drummer's ears. Now, I've been using this setup more and more lately, and I've come to really enjoy the sound that it gets, and I think it's just as valid as some of the other setups, and I hope that it becomes a household name like Space Pair, Glyn Johns, and what I'm going to call the Engelhart Setup. So here's what it sounds like. All right, so now that we've gotten through all of these setups, let's hear what they all sound like back to back with the addition of a bass drum microphone. All right, so which one was your favorite? Let me know down in the comments below. Again, there are so many possibilities with 2 microphones, and I encourage you to experiment and find a setup that works well for you. Just make sure they're in phase. So our third and final video in this mini series will talk about the bass drum and how positioning affects the sound and how it works in tandem with the overhead microphones. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.